what I think I'll do is I'll pick up on what Professor Weinstock was talking about. My presentation focuses a lot on language and how language is represented in both multicultural and intercultural discourses, but I'll be focusing a little bit more on intercultural discourse in Quebec, and I hope the reasons for that will come out as I continue. So over the last 40 years, we've witnessed the development of two dominant visions in response to the tensions that language and ethnocultural diversity for the modern Canadian nation state, Canadian multiculturalism, and more recently, Quebec interculturalism. So there's a few things that I'd like to sort of raise during this talk. The first is that, like Canadian multiculturalism, Quebec interculturalism is a national discourse, and I think we really need to think about it critically from that perspective. Particularly as the discourse has been and is being shaped by conditions of late modernity and globalization. So in so doing, again, I'd like to call attention to the centrality of language as a key terrain across which processes of social organization, identification with, and orientation to the nation in Canada and Quebec are structured, and the ways in which these play out in multicultural and intercultural discourses in Canada and Quebec. What I'd also like to do over the next few minutes is to highlight the complex relationship between institutionalized interculturalism in Quebec, so something that is defined largely by Quebec Francophone intellectuals in the universities, government policy papers, this kind of thing. So institutionalized interculturalism and lived interculturalism. So something that, where the day-to-day, what Victor Armani has called interpenetration of cultures in both public and private spheres, is producing sites of convergence or multiple overlapping common public cultures that in many ways are challenging dominant configurations of this institutional model, and why this is not a bad thing. So hopefully this will also kind of dovetail into a discussion of how this fits within the contextual schism or la cassure entre Montreal puis le reste du Québec. So that's something hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit more about. I will go on. One of the last sort of final thing that I'd like to raise in this talk is to issue a call for a more robust body of critique of Quebec interculturalism. I believe that we need more sites in which the dominant institutional or political articulations of interculturalism interact and engage bravely with a range of new critical perspectives and approaches. So the first thing, Quebec interculturalism as a national discourse as part of a particular nation-building project, and why we need to think about it critically from this perspective. So a number of Quebec scholars, including Marie McAndrews and Gérard Bouchard himself, have acknowledged that tensions between Canadian multiculturalism and Quebec interculturalism are indicative of competing nation-building projects. If we agree with this, and I do, as citizens and scholars, we need to build into our analyses the ways in which nation-building in any context involves a certain amount of social engineering, imagination, myth-making, and manipulation of state resources and historiographies. To do this, in this context, I think we need to focus on how certain norms and beliefs about language are or not represented in discourses of Quebec interculturalism, what they reveal about contextualized patterns of nation building in the Quebec context, and why these things matter. To construct a nation as a natural thing characterized by its own language and culture requires agents to build, among other things, national discourses. I've come to the belief that critical sociolinguistic approaches, and I'm not a sociolinguist, I come to this from somewhere else, but I have come to the belief that critical sociolinguistic approaches have an integral role to play in scholarly and public debate about diversity and integration in the Quebec context, because they help to break down assumptions of language as a neutral or wholly democratic concept. And so far I find that these approaches are somewhat missing from the discussion as it is. So Canadian multiculturalism has been standardized or made dominant. It's been made hegemonic and as a national discourse to a significant extent over the last 40 years or so. This has been done because it's been codified in law, it's been codified in policy, there's been lots of intellectual production, a great deal of critical work, which I'll talk a little bit about later. It's very present in public debate, it's very present in media, so this is something that we are very familiar with, it's standardized, it's accepted that this is Canada's national discourse, multiculturalism. Quebec interculturalism, on the other hand, has only recently shifted onto center stage in academic production in the wake of the Bouchard-Taylor Commission on Reasonable Accommodation. So it's relatively new. The processes of conventionalizing it as a national discourse, on par with Canadian multiculturalism, are relatively new. So to my mind, this is an important time to turn our attention to Quebec interculturalism and ask what it is exactly that's going on. And one of the ways to do this, which links to the roundtable, I've sort of been trying to position it within this idea of theory and practice. So if we look at what's going on in the theory, in the institutional literature in Quebec, something that's coming out of the government, the universities, and the ways in which these overlap. In the wake of the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, a growing body of social science literature, notably in the fields of sociology and political science, has focused on two particular questions. So the first is how interculturalism should be defined. And of course, this brings to mind Gérard Bouchard's, which will, I'm sure, become sort of one of the seminal pieces that he published in the McGill Law Journal, What is Interculturalism? But there have been a number of other scholars and intellectuals who focused on this idea. How should it be defined? The second is considering its viability as an quote-unquote alternative model of integration designed to manage the challenges that diversity presents for majority-minority relations, religion, language, culture, nation, and state in the Quebec context, particularly in relation to Canadian multiculturalism. So most of the work up until this point has been, how do we define this, how do we standardize it, and then how do we put it into practice? I think this new wave of research has been very successful in refining a previously imprecise approach to immigration, social cohesion, cultural pluralism. But one of the things that I found that's missing is sociological research that pushes beyond these normative approaches to critically explore why particular configurations of interculturalism have gained traction in Quebec and why now. So why does it look the way that it does, and why at this particular point in time? Through what kind of ontological perspectives has it been developed? What kind of significance they have or not, and for whom? So why does this matter? I think this matters because discourses of nation in Quebec have morphed conceptually over time in response to various political, social, and economic conditions. So the move from sort of traditionalist ideas about nation, Lionel Groux, et cetera, to, in the 1960s, this move towards a modernist approach, Quebec as a modern nation, to now sort of the more emergent pluralist, globalizing discourses of nation, post-national. So through all of these sort of conceptual changes, certain patterns of social organization and boundaries of belonging between the nous et the eux, or the nous, non-nous, have arguably been reproduced at every stage by the dominant stakeholders of the national project. So if we look at what the institutional literature says on interculturalism, how is this being defined? Dominant normative expressions of interculturalism in Quebec appear to be consistent from varying perspectives and across a spectrum of time and space in their recognition of and commitment to diversity, pluralism, democracy, gender equality, laïcité, although there's some divergence as to what that should look like, but also in the assertion that Quebec is a distinct nation, that the French language is the key defining feature for this nation, and that the Francophone majority must be respected as the dominant culture into which all other groups must integrate. So here I'm referencing the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, Bouchard's independent work, Geneviève Baril, Alain Gigagnon to a certain extent, Micheline Labelle, Labelle Rocher et Rocher. This is also present in the Ministère des Communautés Culturelles et de l'Immigration. So these are sort of the main things that I've extracted from the literature here. And so from a critical perspective, and I'm also bringing to this somebody who would be considered a neo-Quebecoise. I moved here 7 years ago. I'm not studying in the Quebec intellectual system. I come from the University of Toronto, but I feel very much a part of the Société Québécoise. So these questions of what it means to identify with and belong and are both important to me at both a personal and professional level. So I have questions. Why this configuration and why now? One of the things that I find interesting is that there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to the fact that the rise of interculturalism in Quebec in this particular configuration comes at a time when rapidly changing social and economic conditions brought about by globalization have issued a direct challenge to the modernist notion that nations are self-contained social and political units tethered exclusively to one language. Quebec's relationship with these global challenges must, of course, be understood within the historical and political context of its complex colonial past and its internal struggles to reconcile a francophone population that self-identifies as both the majority dominant culture in the territory of Quebec and as a minority culture in the broader, predominantly English-speaking Canadian nation-state, which is operationalized under a rubric of multiculturalism, and the larger North American continent. So again, to approach this from a critical perspective, I think it helps to look at how language came to be the central marker of the Quebec nation and the medium through which ideas about culture and the nation state are legitimized. So prior to the 1960s, French-Canadian identity was not strictly defined by Quebec territorial or linguistic parameters, but along broader ideological and social lines, la foi, la race, la langue. With the passage of modernity into Quebec in the 1960s, and when Quebec adopted a statist orientation to nation building during the Quiet Revolution, processes of secularization began, and it was then that the French language became the central tool in the political mobilization of the Francophone majority in Quebec and the key symbol of its national legitimacy. So this is when la foi, la race were collapsed into language. Language emerged as sort of the main marker here. Heller and Labrie have explored this shifting discourse as a conscious move by Francophone elites in their efforts to envision a source of power other than the church in Quebec. An emphasis on language bridged the traditionalist and modernist discourses of nation, creating a sense of continuity and coherence. In Quebec, language was mobilized because it was perceived as a more palatable symbol of identity and belonging within the new modern national discourse built around civic ideas and democratic principles. And of course, in the province of Quebec, which was a conceptually bounded territory, Francophones made up 85% of the population. This made the most sense from a strategic nation-building point of view. It wouldn't have made sense sort of from a pan-Canadian Francophone point of view. So that was then, and this is now, and I make that rupture intentionally, that we need to sort of position this in a new context. How am I for time? Okay, oh dear. Okay. So I guess the next question is how institutional articulations of interculturalism with language and culture at the core will face challenges in the years to come and what we decide to do with that. Standardized, institutionalized ideas about the French language and its role in constructing a culture of convergence or common public culture based on somewhat fixed ideas of Québécitude, what it means to be a Quebecer and who gets to define that, are being challenged by new forms of code switching and linguistic practices, cultural expression and reference points, accents and the different kinds of bodies, values, and histories that produce and circulate them. One of the tensions that interculturalism has been constructed to manage is that alongside the French fact, bi and multilingualism are an increasing reality in Quebec, particularly in the region of Montreal, where 75% of the immigrants to the province reside. I'm going to skip ahead. While French is strictly codified and institutionalized interculturalism, as well as law and policy, on the ground what we're seeing is an emergence of bi- and multilingual sites as de facto cultural meeting points in which to explore cultural links and contradictions, work, political debate. Things like the Sugar Sammy, the show You're Gonna Rire, le show franglais, he sold 42,000 tickets. 40 sold-out shows for a bilingual show with cultural reference points in Montreal. This would make sense nowhere else. The Montreal hip-hop scene, where you see Creole, French, Spanish, English emerging, this is relatable to a lot of people. Social media, which is a new unregulated set of information where social and linguistic convergence are happening. I don't think these should be dismissed as ephemera. I think there's something more significant happening, and I think we need to think about this. And ask ourselves, what do we do when pluralism and diversity in Quebec bump up against language and reconfigure or challenge institutionalized ideas about its fixed boundaries? The question will be what we decide to do with that as citizens, scholars, NGO workers, politicians, journalists. I think that's the point of today. I think we need to redefine and relocate these challenges so they are representative of how mutual and reciprocal cultural interpretation is taking shape within a civic culture at the heart of dominant Francophone society in a globalized world. Multiculturalism in the Canadian context has been the site of some highly critical anti-colonial race and feminist analyses. I was going to list them, but I won't. Multiculturalism is controversial because it should be. There has been very little critical work in relation to Quebec interculturalism. The ones that have been published haven't been engaged with to the extent that I believe that they should. So we need to ask, why isn't a body of critical work on Quebec interculturalism, why hasn't it emerged? If it isn't happening at the institutional level, first we need to ask ourselves why, and then we need to go look for it. So, en guise de conclusion, j'appuie fortement l'idée de l'interculturalisme comme un espace de conflit, de débat et de médiation, comme a dit Michel Vatz-Laroussi la semaine passée à l'Université de Montréal. L'interculturalisme québécois doit être un espace inclusif, participatoire, où le discours critique et militant se croise avec le discours politique pour créer un espace peut-être inconfortable, mais productif et dynamique. As Quebec society stands at the cusp of being redefined by massive generational shifts, new forms of social media, and the multiple processes of immigration and globalization that will shape the 21st century, it's one thing to critique, but it's my hope that the discussion moving forward will pivot bravely on why these things still matter in the Canadian context. Thank you very much.